The society pages called it the charity case of the decade. When Nathaniel Sterling, heir to a legendary Boston real estate empire, married a quiet, modest museum archivist, the old money elites sharpened their knives. His family sneered at her unbranded coats, mocked her battered Volvo, and whispered that she was nothing but a gold-digging interloper, dragging their pristine lineage into the mud. They made it their mission to break her, utterly confident in the supremacy of their generational wealth. What they didn't know, what absolutely no one knew, was that the quiet woman, smiling politely through their daily abuse, could buy their entire dynasty with the spare change in her portfolio. The Sterling family estate in Newport, Rhode Island, was a sprawling monstrosity of Gilded Age architecture, all marble columns, imported Italian fountains, and an oppressive air of inherited superiority. It was here, amidst the manicured rose gardens and the judgmental stares of New England's elite, that Celine Anderson was expected to learn her place. From the moment Nathaniel introduced her to his family, the battle lines were drawn. Nathaniel was the golden boy, an idealistic architect who had largely removed himself from the cutthroat operations of Sterling Enterprises, preferring to design sustainable housing rather than ruthlessly acquire commercial high-rises. He loved Celine fiercely, drawn to her quiet intelligence, her absolute lack of pretense, and the deep, soulful way she looked at the world. He believed love was enough. He was, in the eyes of his family, tragically naive. Beatrice Sterling, Nathaniel's mother, was a woman whose facial expressions were permanently frozen, somewhere between a polite smile and a grimace of disgust. She wore her wealth like armor, draped in Chanel and diamonds that had been in the family since the 1920s. When she first laid eyes on Celine, who had arrived for weekend cocktails wearing a simple, unbranded beige trench coat and carrying a scuffed leather satchel, Beatrice's eyes had narrowed into predatory slits. A historian, Beatrice had purred over a crystal glass of gin, letting the word roll off her tongue as if it were synonymous with a contagious disease. How quaint. And tell me, Celine, do you plan to rely on Nathaniel's trust fund to finance your little academic hobbies? Or will you be maintaining your own meager employment? Nathaniel had bristled, his jaw tightening. Mother, Celine is highly respected in her field. She consults for several private archives. I'm sure she does, darling, Beatrice had replied, her gaze fixed entirely on the scuff mark on Celine's sensible loafers. We just have to be so careful these days. The world is full of opportunists looking for a comfortable parachute. Celine had merely smiled, a serene, unbothered expression that infuriated Beatrice more than any argument could have. I assure you, Mrs. Sterling, I have no interest in Nathaniel's money. I am completely self-sufficient. The Sterlings had taken that as a pathetic bluff. The true depths of their hostility were revealed a month before the wedding, in the mahogany-paneled office of Richard Sterling, the family patriarch and CEO. Richard was a broad-shouldered, severe man who viewed his family members less as relatives and more as assets to be managed. Celine was summoned to the office without Nathaniel's knowledge. Waiting for her were Richard, Beatrice, and the family's terrifyingly efficient corporate lawyer, Arthur Pendleton. On the heavy oak desk sat a prenuptial agreement, thicker than a telephone directory. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Miss Anderson," Richard said, not bothering to offer her a seat. "You are marrying into the Sterling family. That comes with certain protections. This document ensures that in the event of a divorce, which statistically speaking is highly probable, you walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which, according to our background checks, is a rented apartment in Brooklyn, a 2014 Volvo, and roughly $12,000 in savings. Beatrice leaned against the windowsill, arms crossed. "Sign it, Celine. Prove to us that you aren't the gold digger everyone at the country club says you are. If you love him, the money shouldn't matter." They expected tears. They expected outrage. They expected her to demand revisions, to fight for a piece of the pie, thereby proving their suspicions right. Instead, Celine walked up to the desk, picked up the solid gold Montblanc pen Pendleton offered, and flipped directly to the last page. She didn't read a single clause. She didn't ask a single question. She smoothly signed her name, Celine Anderson, and set the pen down gently. "If that makes you feel more secure, Richard," Celine said softly, her voice perfectly level. "I am happy to sign." Richard and Pendleton exchanged a bewildered look. Beatrice scoffed, interpreting Celine's swift compliance as the desperate act of a woman terrified of losing her meal ticket. "Well," Beatrice muttered, "at least she knows she has no leverage." As Celine walked out of the towering skyscraper that housed Sterling Enterprises, she pulled a burner phone from her scuffed satchel. She dialed a number with a +41 country code. "Monsieur Laurent," Celine said in flawless, unaccented French as she stepped into the bustling Manhattan street. "Madame," came the smooth, deferential reply of her chief wealth manager in Geneva. "Has the merger with the Scandinavian shipping line been approved?" "It has." "Proceed with the acquisition," Celine instructed, her eyes tracking the gleaming Sterling Enterprises logo high above her. "And Laurent?" "The prenup is signed. They insisted on a complete separation of assets." A low chuckle echoed through the receiver. "A complete separation? Madame, they have just legally locked themselves out of the Cavendish-Anderson Trust. They have protected you from them." "Yes." Celine smiled, a genuine sharp smile that the Sterlings had never seen. "They think they are guarding a fortress, Laurent. They don't realize they just locked the gates to a sinking ship." Celine Anderson was an illusion. Her real name, buried under layers of corporate shell companies, ironclad privacy NDAs, and international trusts, was Celine Anderson Cavendish. She was the sole surviving heir to the Cavendish Global Syndicate, a European conglomerate with controlling stakes in everything from rare earth lithium mines in South America to global shipping logistics and commercial banking. Her net worth was not $12,000. It was closer to $42 billion. She lived simply because wealth, to her, was not a performance. Having grown up surrounded by the suffocating, dangerous pressures of immense dynastic power, she craved normalcy. She loved her quiet job handling rare manuscripts. She loved her old car. Most of all, she loved Nathaniel, who loved the poor archivist. But as she looked back up at the Sterling building, she knew the peace wouldn't last. The Sterlings were bullies. And Celine, despite her gentle facade, had the power to crush them with a single phone call. 6 months into the marriage, the psychological warfare orchestrated by the Sterling women escalated from polite microaggressions to outright public humiliation. Nathaniel was blissfully unaware, spending his weeks on construction sites in upstate New York, leaving Celine to navigate the treacherous social waters of Manhattan's Upper East Side alone. The primary architect of Celine's misery was Victoria Sterling, Nathaniel's younger sister. Victoria was a socialite in the most weaponized sense of the word. Married to Harrison Reed, a blustering, red-faced hedge fund manager, Victoria operated under the delusion that cruelty was a substitute for a personality. It was mid-October when Victoria hosted a small, intimate luncheon at the exclusive Pierre Hotel. Celine was invited, or rather, summoned, as the family's obligatory punching bag. The private dining room was filled with 8 women, dripping in designer labels and generational arrogance. Celine arrived wearing a beautifully tailored but unbranded navy blue wool dress. It was actually custom-made by a master tailor in Milan who didn't believe in visible tags, but to Victoria's label-obsessed eyes, it looked like it came from a discount department store. "Celine, darling, you made it," Victoria cooed, air-kissing the space next to Celine's cheeks. "I was worried your little car might have broken down again. We really must get Harrison to look into leasing you a sensible Honda. It's embarrassing for Nathaniel to have his wife driving a Hazard." A few of the women at the table tittered behind their crystal champagne flutes. Celine took her seat calmly. "The Volvo runs perfectly fine, Victoria. But thank you for your concern." As the luncheon progressed, the conversation deliberately shifted to topics designed to exclude and belittle Celine: luxury yacht charters in Saint-Tropez, exclusive private banking tiers, and the exhausting burden of managing trust funds. "It must be so refreshing to live a simple life, Celine," remarked Eleanor, one of Victoria's sycophants, "to not have to worry about asset management or real estate portfolios. What is it exactly that you do all day? Dust old books?" "I verify the provenance of historical documents," Celine answered mildly. "It requires a great deal of research and patience." "How sweet," Victoria interrupted, her eyes locking onto the delicate, understated diamond pendant resting against Celine's collarbone. It was the only piece of jewelry Celine wore besides her plain wedding band. "Speaking of provenance, Celine, wherever did you get that necklace? It looks like glass. Harrison bought me a flawless 2-carat pendant from Harry Winston for our anniversary. You really shouldn't wear costume jewelry to the Pierre, darling. It lowers the tone of the room." Celine touched the pendant. It was a flawless, internally perfect Type 2A diamond, originally gifted to her great-grandmother by a Russian Grand Duchess. It was worth more than Victoria's entire jewelry collection combined. "It's a family piece," Celine said softly. "Oh, from your mother? The school teacher?" Victoria feigned a sympathetic pout. "Well, sentimental value is everything, isn't it? Even if the stone is cloudy. Actually, Harrison is looking for a new administrative assistant at the fund. You know, managing calendars, fetching coffee. It pays quite well. It might help you afford some nicer things so you don't look so out of place at family events." The table fell silent, the insult hanging heavy and undeniable in the air. Offering a sterling daughter-in-law a secretarial job was the ultimate slap in the face. Celine didn't flush. She didn't cry. She picked up her fork, took a small bite of her salad, and looked directly into Victoria's eyes. "I appreciate the offer, Victoria, but I think Harrison might have his hands full managing his current assets. I read in the Financial Times that his flagship fund has taken a rather severe hit in the Asian tech sector recently. Over-leveraged, wasn't it?" The colour drained instantly from Victoria's face. The other women exchanged shocked, uncomfortable glances. Harrison's financial troubles were a fiercely guarded secret, a desperate situation he had been trying to hide from his investors and his own family. I don't know what garbage you've been reading," Victoria stammered, her voice suddenly shrill. "Harrison's fund is performing exceptionally well." "My mistake," Celine said, her tone smooth as glass. "I must have misunderstood the market analysis." She hadn't misunderstood. Celine's family conglomerate held a massive short position against Harrison's poorly managed fund. She knew exactly how close he was to total ruin. The luncheon ended shortly after, the triumphant atmosphere thoroughly shattered. As Celine walked home through Central Park, her phone buzzed. It was Nathaniel. "Hey, sweetheart." His warm voice washed over her, a stark contrast to the venom she had just endured. "How was lunch with the Vipers? Educational, Celine smiled, watching the autumn leaves fall. Are you coming home tonight? I wish I could, Nathaniel sighed, sounding exhausted. My father called an emergency board meeting. He's been frantic lately. The commercial real estate market is softening, and apparently the company has some major balloon payments due on the downtown properties. He's furious I'm not there to help him beg the banks for an extension. Celine stopped walking. Which bank, Nathaniel? Ironclad Financial, Nathaniel said. They hold the primary mortgages on half the sterling portfolio. Dad's been trying to get their executives on the phone for weeks to renegotiate, but they're stonewalling him. He's terrified they're going to call in the loans. If they do, Celine, it could bankrupt the family. I see, Celine murmured. Don't worry, Nathaniel. I'm sure your father will figure it out. He's a resourceful man. I hope so. I don't care about the money, Celine, you know that. But seeing the family legacy collapse, it would kill him. I love you. I'll be home tomorrow. I love you too. Celine hung up the phone. She sat down on a park bench, her mind whirring with surgical precision. Ironclad Financial. She opened an encrypted app on her phone and sent a single, secure message to Monsieur Laurent in Geneva. Pull the ownership structure for Ironclad Financial. Cross-reference with the Cavendish Holding subsidiaries. The reply came 3 minutes later. Madame, Ironclad Financial is a wholly owned subsidiary of Aetherius Holdings. Aetherius Holdings is 100% controlled by your private trust. You are the ultimate beneficial owner of Ironclad. Celine stared at the screen. The Sterling family, the people who mocked her clothes, insulted her background, and tried to force her to serve their coffee, were entirely, irrevocably in her debt. She literally owned the ground they walked on. The tension within the Sterling family reached a boiling point at the annual Sterling Summer Gala. Held at the Newport estate, it was the social event of the season, a desperate, glittering facade meant to project unshakable wealth to their peers, even as Richard Sterling secretly sweated blood over his impending financial doom. Beatrice was in a foul mood, her anxiety manifesting in targeted cruelty toward Celine. As Celine descended the grand staircase, wearing a stunning, minimalist, emerald green gown, another bespoke piece from Europe that Beatrice instantly dismissed as drab, her mother-in-law intercepted her. "Celine!" Beatrice hissed, grabbing her arm with a grip like a vice. "You will stay out of the photographs tonight. We have important investors attending, people who actually matter. The last thing Richard needs is you standing there looking like a lost little match girl." "I'll stay out of your way, Beatrice," Celine said, gently but firmly removing the woman's hand from her arm. The ballroom was suffocating, filled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the hollow laughter of the elite. Celine retreated to the fringes, observing the room. She noticed Richard Sterling, cornered by a group of serious-looking men in dark suits, his usually ruddy face pale and sweating. He was checking his phone every 3 minutes. Victoria, meanwhile, was holding court near a massive, intricately painted, blue and white porcelain vase displayed on an antique pedestal. It was, according to Beatrice, a Ming Dynasty artifact worth upwards of $2 million, the crown jewel of the Sterling estate. Celine was quietly sipping sparkling water when Victoria, swaying slightly from too many martinis, locked eyes with her. A malicious spark ignited in Victoria's gaze. She whispered something to her husband, Harrison, who smirked, and then she walked directly toward Celine. "Hiding in the corners again, Celine," Victoria slurred slightly, stopping right beside the pedestal holding the vase. "It's pathetic, really. You bring absolutely no value to this family. You don't have the connections to help Richard. You don't have the capital to help Harrison. You just drain resources." "I'm not draining anything, Victoria," Celine replied calmly, keeping a safe distance. "Oh, please, you're a parasite," Victoria sneered. She took a step closer, intentionally stumbling. As she faked her fall, she threw her arm out, her hand slamming hard into the side of the priceless Ming vase. The pedestal wobbled. The vase tipped. Celine lunged forward instinctively to catch it, but she was too far away. Crash! The noise silenced the entire ballroom. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the alcove. Shards of blue and white porcelain were scattered across the polished hardwood floor. Victoria gasped, immediately bursting into theatrical tears. "Celine, what did you do?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at her sister-in-law. "I just bumped into her and she shoved me. She knocked it over." Beatrice pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of absolute fury. When she saw the shattered vase, she let out a sound like a wounded animal. "The Ming vase! My God, the Ming vase!" Richard, looking grateful for the distraction from his investors, marched over. "What is the meaning of this?" "She broke it, Dad," Victoria sobbed, clutching Harrison's arm. "Celine threw a tantrum because I told her she needed to socialize more. She pushed me right into it." Nathaniel, who had been across the room, finally broke through the circle of onlookers. "Victoria, that's insane. Celine would never do that." "We all saw it, Nathaniel," Beatrice screamed, completely losing her aristocratic composure. She turned her venomous gaze to Celine. "You clumsy, spiteful little nobody. That piece has been in this family for 4 generations. It is worth $2 million. And you are going to pay for it. Every single cent." "Mother, stop it." Nathaniel stepped in front of Celine, shielding her. "It was an accident. We have insurance." "Insurance won't cover malicious destruction," Richard bellowed, his own stress boiling over. "Your mother is right, Nathaniel. This is the last straw. She is a liability. We drew up the prenup for a reason. You will divorce her, or I will cut you out of this family entirely. And you," he pointed at Celine, "will be hearing from our lawyers for the damages." The entire room held its breath, waiting for the poor, mousy archivist to break down, to beg for forgiveness, or to run away in tears. Celine slowly stepped around Nathaniel. She looked down at the shattered porcelain at her feet. She nudged a piece with the toe of her shoe, then bent down and picked up a large, curved shard from the base of the vase. She examined the underside of it for a long, agonizing moment. Then, Celine Anderson began to laugh. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a low, melodic, genuinely amused sound that echoed unnervingly through the silent ballroom. "What is so funny to you, you psychotic little gold digger?" Beatrice spat. Celine held up the shard, turning it so the bright chandelier light caught the underside of the base. "I'm laughing, Beatrice," Celine said, her voice projecting clearly across the room, "because this is not a Ming dynasty vase. How dare you? I am a historian, remember?" Celine cut her off, her tone suddenly commanding, stripping away the meek facade entirely. "I specialize in antiquities and provenance. The glaze on true Ming porcelain has a distinct iron rust spotting. This glaze is uniformly flat. Furthermore," she turned the shard toward Richard, "true 15th century imperial kilns did not stamp 'Made in Taiwan' on the bottom of their ceramics." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Richard froze. Beatrice's face went from pale to a mottled, apoplectic red. "Let me see that." Harrison snatched the shard from Celine's hand. He looked at the bottom, and his jaw dropped. Right there, in tiny, faded English letters, was the manufacturing stamp of a 1980s mass production facility. The priceless heirloom was a high-end replica, worth perhaps $500. You've been parading a fake to your friends for decades to inflate your net worth, Celine said, her voice ringing with icy clarity. A rather fitting metaphor for the Sterling family, don't you think? Before Beatrice could recover enough to scream, Richard's phone, which he was still clutching in his hand, began to ring loudly. The caller ID flashed on the screen, visible to Celine and the people standing closest. Ironclad Financial, Executive Office. Richard looked at the phone as if it were a live grenade. He swallowed hard, the fake vase entirely forgotten. He practically ran out of the ballroom, pressing the phone to his ear. Hello. Yes, this is Richard Sterling. Please, you have to give me more time. His voice faded as he pushed through the terrace doors. The damage was done. The whisper network of the elite had already begun buzzing. The Sterlings possessed fake antiquities. The Sterlings were begging banks for time. The illusion of their invincibility was cracking. Nathaniel looked at Celine, stunned by the sudden, fierce authority she had just displayed. Celine, how did you? I have a good eye for fakes, Nathaniel, Celine said softly, looking directly at Victoria, who was shrinking backward into the crowd. And I have a very low tolerance for bullies. She turned and walked out of the ballroom, her emerald dress trailing behind her like royalty, leaving the Sterling family to stand amidst the broken pieces of their own deception. As she reached the quiet of the gardens, she pulled out her phone. Laurent, she said into the receiver. Madame, are you well? I am perfect, Celine said, looking up at the stars over Newport. Richard Sterling just took a call from Ironclad. Tell the executives to reject his plea for an extension. Call in the entire debt. All of it. Tomorrow morning. It will bankrupt them, madam. The entire Sterling enterprise will be insolvent by noon. I know, Celine said, her eyes cold and bright. Prepare the acquisition papers. I am going to buy my father-in-law's company for pennies on the dollar. Monday morning arrived in Manhattan, not with the gentle glow of a sunrise, but with the brutal, flashing red numbers of the Bloomberg terminal. At exactly 8 a.m., the financial world shifted on its axis. The Wall Street Journal ran a digital exclusive that sent shockwaves through the elite echo chambers of the Upper East Side. The headline was devastatingly simple. Sterling Enterprises defaults on $1.4 billion commercial debt. Ironclad Financial Initiates receivership. Inside the cavernous, usually pristine penthouse of Richard and Beatrice Sterling on Park Avenue, the atmosphere was one of total, unmitigated panic. Richard had not slept since the gala. His bespoke Brioni suit was crumpled, his tie undone, and his hands trembled as he stared at the financial news networks broadcasting his ruin across the globe. How could they do this? Beatrice shrieked, her morning coffee forgotten, spilling onto a Persian rug. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly for an hour, friends, rivals, and board members demanding answers she didn't have. Ironclad has worked with us for 30 years. We golf with the CEO in the Hamptons. The CEO was fired on Friday, Beatrice, Richard barked, his face a terrifying shade of purple. Some European holding company bought out Ironclad last month in a silent acquisition and cleaned house. The new board doesn't care about our golf handicaps. They called the debt. All of it. The Hudson Yards project, the Tribeca commercial spaces, the Chicago towers. It's all gone if we don't produce $1 billion in liquid capital by Friday. Before Beatrice could process the catastrophic loss of her social standing, the penthouse elevator chimed and Victoria burst through the doors. She looked nothing like the polished socialite from the Pierre Hotel luncheon. Her mascara was smeared, and she was clutching a crumpled Hermes Birkin bag like a life preserver. "Daddy, you have to help us," Victoria sobbed, practically collapsing onto the velvet sofa. "Harrison is ruined." Richard rubbed his temples, a migraine blinding him. Victoria, I am currently facing the dissolution of a century-old company. I do not have the bandwidth for Harrison's whining. No, you don't understand, Victoria screamed hysterically. It's not just a bad quarter. He got margin called. Some massive European syndicate realized he was over-leveraged in Asian tech and short-squeezed his entire portfolio. Oakmont Capital is insolvent. The SEC was at our townhouse at 6 this morning, boxing up his hard drives. We have nothing. They froze the accounts. Beatrice slumped into an armchair, the colour completely draining from her face. Within 48 hours of the broken fake vase incident, the two pillars of the Sterling family's arrogance, their corporate empire and their hedge fund wealth, had been systematically dismantled. Across town, in their modest, rent-controlled Brooklyn apartment, Celine poured Nathaniel a cup of black coffee. He sat at the small kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen in stunned silence. He had never cared for the ruthless mechanics of his father's business, but seeing his family's legacy disintegrate in real time was a profound shock. "I need to go to the office," Nathaniel said quietly, running a hand through his hair. "Dad is going to have a heart attack. I know we don't see eye to eye, Celine, but they're my family. I have to see if I can help." Celine placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her expression was perfectly serene, offering the quiet support he expected, while beneath the surface, a master chess player analyzed the final moves of the game. "Go to him," Celine said softly. "But Nathaniel, be careful. Desperate people rarely act with honor." When Nathaniel arrived at the towering Sterling Enterprises headquarters in Midtown, it resembled a war zone. Employees were whispering in the hallways, packing personal items into cardboard boxes. In the executive suite on the top floor, Richard was pacing like a caged tiger, flanked by his legal counsel, Arthur Pendleton. "Nathaniel!" "Finally!" Richard snapped, his eyes wild. "We need capital. I've called every bank from Morgan Stanley to Deutsche. No one will touch us. Ironclad's move has poisoned the well." "Dad, what are our options?" Nathaniel asked, taking a seat at the massive mahogany conference table. Arthur Pendleton, usually a man of unflappable calm, looked physically ill. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and slid a thick, cream-colored folder across the table. "We have one option, Nathaniel," Pendleton said grimly. "An hour ago, I received an unsolicited term sheet. A private wealth syndicate based in Geneva has offered to buy our debt from Ironclad and inject $500 million in emergency liquidity to keep the doors open." Richard stopped pacing. "Who are they?" "The Cavendish Global Syndicate," Pendleton replied. "They are notoriously secretive. Old European money, trillions in assets. They operate through layers of proxies, but they have a reputation for absolute ruthlessness." "What are their terms?" Nathaniel asked, sensing the trap. Pendleton swallowed hard. "They want 80% equity. They want total voting control of the board, and they want you, Richard, to step down as CEO immediately. They are offering pennies on the dollar to buy us out of bankruptcy." "It's a hostile takeover," Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany. "They engineered this. They bought Ironclad just to strangle us and steal my company." "Perhaps," Pendleton agreed quietly. "But they are holding all the cards. If you don't sign this by noon tomorrow, Ironclad seizes the assets, the company goes into Chapter 11, and the Sterling family walks away with absolutely nothing. Zero." Richard collapsed into his leather executive chair, a broken man. The arrogance that had defined his life had been shattered in a single morning. "Set the meeting," he whispered hoarsely. "Tell Cavendish we'll sign." Tuesday morning broke with a heavy, oppressive grey sky over Manhattan, a fitting, pathetic fallacy for the funeral of the Sterling legacy. The grand boardroom of Sterling Enterprises was silent. The air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and impending doom. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking 10 years older than he had on Friday. Beatrice had insisted on attending, refusing to be left out of what she considered a historical family tragedy. She sat beside her husband, her face tight, her posture rigid, dressed in sombre black Chanel as if attending a wake. Victoria and Harrison were there as well, desperate to see if the buyout would somehow include a lifeline for their frozen assets. Nathaniel sat near the end of the table, feeling a profound sense of detachment from the greed suffocating the room. At exactly 11:55 a.m., Arthur Pendleton checked his Patek Philippe watch. The representative from Cavendish should be here any moment. I implore you all, remain calm. We are entirely at their mercy. I will not be humiliated in my own building, Richard grumbled, adjusting his tie. I built this empire. You inherited it, Richard, Beatrice hissed, her anxiety making her vicious. And you lost it. Before Richard could snap back, the heavy double oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. A tall, impeccably tailored man with a silver briefcase walked in. It was Monsieur Laurent. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit and carried an air of effortless European authority. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Beatrice. He walked directly to the window, set his briefcase on a side table, and turned to face the doors. Monsieur Sterling, Laurent said, his voice smooth and heavily accented. I am Laurent, Chief Wealth Manager for the Cavendish Global Syndicate. Let's get this over with, Richard said, sliding the contract toward the center of the table. Where do I sign to hand over my life's work? You misunderstand, monsieur, Laurent replied calmly, not moving toward the table. I am not here to sign the documents. I am merely the proxy. The ultimate beneficial owner of the Cavendish Trust insists on finalizing this acquisition personally. Beatrice scoffed. And who exactly is this phantom billionaire who finds it amusing to destroy our family? The sound of confident, measured footsteps echoed from the marble hallway outside. The boardroom doors swung open completely. Celine walked in. She was not wearing her scuffed loafers. She was not wearing her unbranded beige trench coat. She wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored white Tom Ford suit that radiated power. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, fell in sleek waves. The cloudy, costume diamond pendant rested against her collarbone, catching the recessed lighting of the boardroom and throwing brilliant, undeniable prisms of light across the walls. Beside her walked 2 massive security personnel who immediately took up positions at the door. Nathaniel blinked, his jaw dropping slightly. Celine, what are you doing here? Beatrice practically leapt out of her chair. Have you lost your mind? Security. How did this woman get up here? Celine, get out! This is a confidential, high-level corporate buyout. We don't have time for your pathetic little attempts at— Sit down, Beatrice, Celine said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that cut through the room like a physical blow. It was the voice of a woman accustomed to commanding empires. Beatrice froze, stunned by the sheer force of the command, and slowly sank back into her leather chair, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Celine walked gracefully to the empty chair directly opposite Richard at the far end of the long table. She didn't sit. She placed her hands on the polished mahogany and looked down the length of the table at the people who had tortured her for months. Mr. Pendleton, Celine said, not breaking eye contact with Richard, have you reviewed the terms of the acquisition with the former executive board? Arthur Pendleton, to his immense credit, only hesitated for 2 seconds before looking at his own client, then at Celine, and realizing the seismic shift in reality. He swallowed hard. I have, madam. Good. Celine finally sat down, crossing her legs with elegant precision. Then you know that as of noon today, Cavendish Global owns Ironclad Financial, which holds your debt. We also hold the primary leverage against Oakmont Capital, which recently resulted in Harrison's rather unfortunate margin call. I believe in vertical integration. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy void as the terrifying truth dawned on them. You! Richard choked out, his face turning an ashen grey. He pointed a trembling finger at her. You are Cavendish. My legal name is Celine Anderson Cavendish, she replied smoothly. My great-grandfather founded the syndicate. I inherited sole control of it 5 years ago. Victoria let out a strange, high-pitched whimper. She looked at her husband, who was staring at Celine with the wide, terrified eyes of a man standing on the tracks, watching a freight train approach. This is a joke, Beatrice whispered, shaking her head in violent denial. This is some sick, elaborate joke. You're an archivist. You drive a 10-year-old Volvo. I am an archivist because I love history, Beatrice, Celine corrected her, a cold smile playing on her lips. I drive a Volvo because it's reliable, and I despise ostentation. I signed your insulting prenuptial agreement without reading it, because my lawyers had already ensured it legally severed you from my family's $42 billion trust. You wanted to protect your assets from the gold digger. You ended up walling yourselves into a tomb. She looked at Victoria, who was shrinking into her chair. I told you Harrison's fund was over-leveraged, Victoria. You should have listened instead of worrying about whether my jewellery met the standards of the Pierre. Celine then turned her attention back to Richard. She pulled a Mont Blanc pen from the inside pocket of her jacket, the exact same model of pen Richard had forced her to use to sign the prenup. Sign the papers, Richard, Celine commanded, tapping the pen against the table. You will surrender your shares, step down as CEO, and vacate this building by 5 p.m. If you do, I will ensure the company's lower-level employees keep their jobs, and I will leave you enough in a retirement trust to live comfortably, albeit quietly. If you refuse, I will let Ironclad bankrupt you by Friday, and I will personally buy your Newport estate at the foreclosure auction and bulldoze it. Richard Sterling looked at the quiet, modest woman he had dismissed as a charity case. He saw no mercy in her eyes, only the cold, calculated execution of a corporate titan. With shaking hands, he reached for the pen. The scratch of the gold Mont Blanc pen against the thick, cream-colored acquisition paper sounded extraordinarily loud in the silent boardroom. Richard Sterling's hand trembled so violently that his signature, usually a bold, sweeping desalination of his ego, was reduced to a jagged, barely legible scrawl. With that final, erratic stroke, the Sterling real estate empire, built over 4 generations of ruthless acquisitions and unyielding pride, legally ceased to belong to the Sterling family. Monsieur Laurent stepped forward smoothly, sliding the documents into his silver briefcase with a quiet click that felt like the slamming of a vault door. The transfer of equity is complete, Laurent murmured, bowing his head slightly to Celine. The wire transfers covering the corporate debt have been authorized. Sterling Enterprises is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Cavendish Global. Richard slumped back into his chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. He looked entirely hollowed out. Beside him, Beatrice was weeping silently, her meticulously applied makeup running in dark, jagged tracks down her pale cheeks. The impenetrable armor of her Chanel suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a defeated woman. Victoria, however, could not accept the finality of the moment. Panic overrode her deeply ingrained sense of superiority. She lunged forward, pressing her hands against the table, her eyes wide and pleading as she looked at the woman she had spent the last year torturing. "Celine, please!" Victoria's voice cracked, dropping an octave from her usual shrill arrogance. "You made your point. You won. But Oakmont Capital, Harrison's fund, we're facing federal indictments if we can't cover the margin calls. You have to unfreeze the assets. We're family." Celine tilted her head, her expression a mask of chilling neutrality. "Family. Victoria, less than a week ago, you deliberately shattered a vase and attempted to frame me for it, so your father would force Nathaniel to divorce me. You humiliated me at your luncheons. You offered me a job fetching your husband's coffee because my diamond wasn't up to your standards." Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but Celine cut him off with a single sharp glance. "As for your assets, Victoria," Celine continued, her voice perfectly level, "Oakmont Capital was built on a foundation of sand and predatory short-selling. Cavendish simply played the game better than Harrison did. There is no bailout for incompetence. However, I am not entirely without mercy." Celine pulled a crisp business card from her blazer pocket and slid it across the immense table. It stopped precisely in front of Victoria. "Cavendish runs a philanthropic foundation in the Bronx, focusing on literacy programs for underprivileged children," Celine said. "We are currently hiring administrative assistants to manage the filing rooms and schedule the delivery trucks. The starting salary is $42,000 a year. It comes with full dental. If you and Harrison need a lifeline to avoid homelessness, I suggest you call HR by tomorrow morning. Don't be late for the interview." Victoria stared at the card as if it were coated in poison, a fresh sob tearing from her throat. "Meeting adjourned," Celine announced, standing up. "Mr. Pendleton, please escort the former executive board out of the building. They have until 5 p.m. to clear their personal effects from their offices." As the security personnel stepped forward to enforce the eviction, the room slowly emptied. Richard leaned heavily on Arthur Pendleton, shuffling toward the door like an old man. Beatrice followed, refusing to make eye contact. Only Nathaniel remained. He hadn't spoken a word since Celine entered the room. He sat in his chair, staring at his wife as if she were a stranger who had just materialized from thin air. The quiet, bookish archivist who spent her Sundays reading historical biographies on their thrift store couch was gone. In her place stood a corporate titan who had just orchestrated a multi-billion-dollar bloodless coup. Celine gestured for Laurent and the security team to wait outside. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving the husband and wife alone in the cavernous boardroom. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fraught with unspoken questions. Celine let out a long, slow breath, and for the first time that morning, the icy facade of the Cavendish air melted away. Her shoulders dropped, and she looked at Nathaniel with genuine vulnerability. "Nathaniel," she started, her voice softening back into the tone he knew so well. "Who are you?" Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rough with shock. He stood up, pacing a few steps away. "I thought I knew everything about you. I thought we were building a life together from scratch. But you own half the world. You destroyed my father." "I didn't destroy your father, Nathaniel. His own hubris and gross financial mismanagement did," Celine said gently, stepping closer but giving him space. "I simply bought the debt he couldn't pay. If I hadn't stepped in, Ironclad would have liquidated this entire company by Friday. Your father would be facing criminal negligence charges for his accounting practices. I saved the company so I could restructure it." "But you lied to me," Nathaniel said, turning to face her, the hurt evident in his eyes. "Every day, for years." "I hid my wealth," Celine corrected him softly. "I didn't lie about who I am. I am still the woman who loves you. I am still the woman who loves history. But I was born into a cage made of gold, Nathaniel. People only ever saw the Cavendish name. They saw a bank, an asset, a target. When I met you, you didn't care about my scuffed shoes. You didn't care that I lived in a walk-up. You just loved me. I couldn't bear to ruin that by introducing the money. Nathaniel ran a hand over his face, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. And my family? The prenup? They proved exactly why I hide it, Celine said, her tone firming slightly. They measured my human worth by the designer labels I didn't wear. They tried to break me because they thought I was weak and poor. I signed that prenup to protect you from them and to protect my family's legacy from their greed. Nathaniel let out a hollow, incredulous laugh. They thought they were trapping a mouse, and they locked themselves in a room with a lion. He looked back at Celine. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a profound realization of what she had endured at the hands of his mother and sister, all while holding the power to ruin them at any second. She had taken their abuse out of love for him, until they threatened his future too. Nathaniel walked across the room and stopped in front of her. He reached out, gently touching the cloudy diamond pendant resting on her collarbone. I always thought this was beautiful, he murmured. It belonged to a grand duchess, Celine smiled faintly. I don't care about the money, Celine. You know that, Nathaniel said, his eyes searching hers. But I need to know. What happens now? What do you want to do with all of this? He gestured to the boardroom. I want to fire the commercial real estate executives who are bleeding the city dry, Celine said without hesitation. And I want to appoint a new CEO, an architect who understands sustainable housing, someone who actually wants to build things that matter, rather than just acquiring them. Nathaniel stared at her, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking through his shock. You're insane. I'm a Cavendish, Celine corrected, reaching up to take his hand. We just have a very aggressive way of supporting our spouses' careers. 6 months later, the society pages of New York had a new obsession, though the tone had shifted from vicious mockery to terrified reverence. Sterling Enterprises had been formally rebranded as Cavendish Sterling Sustainable Developments. The aggressive commercial acquisitions that had defined Richard Sterling's tenure were liquidated. In their place, under the direction of the newly minted CEO, Nathaniel Sterling, the company was breaking ground on 3 massive, eco-friendly affordable housing projects across the 5 boroughs. The transition had not been easy, but it had been complete. Richard and Beatrice Sterling had been forced to vacate the Newport estate. True to her word, Celine had purchased the property at the foreclosure auction. She hadn't bulldozed it, however. She had donated the sprawling Gilded Age mansion to the state of Rhode Island to be used as a public museum and historical archive. Richard and Beatrice now lived in a comfortable but strictly average 3-bedroom condominium in Boca Raton, Florida, funded by a tightly controlled trust Celine had established. Beatrice spent her days complaining to the local country club members about the theft of her empire, though her audience had grown remarkably thin since she could no longer afford to pick up the bar tab. As for Victoria and Harrison, reality had hit them with the force of a freight train. Stripped of their stolen assets and blacklisted from Wall Street, they had been forced to downsize to a small apartment in Queens. Harrison, humbled by the threat of prison time, had taken a job as a mid-level risk analyst at a minor insurance firm. Victoria, much to the amusement of the New York elite, had actually taken Celine up on her offer. She worked at the front desk of the Cavendish Philanthropic Literacy Foundation, answering phones and filing paperwork. It was rumored that she had finally learned how to make her own coffee. Celine and Nathaniel did not move into the Sterling penthouse. They kept their rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, though Celine did finally upgrade the 2014 Volvo to a slightly newer, heavily armored, hybrid SUV for security purposes. On a crisp autumn afternoon, exactly 1 year after the infamous Pierre Hotel luncheon, Celine stood on the balcony of the new Cavendish Sterling headquarters. She wore a simple, unbranded wool coat, her hands resting in her pockets as she watched the sun set over the city. Nathaniel stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "The blueprints for the Bronx project just got approved by the city council," he murmured, kissing the side of her head. "We break ground next month." "I'm proud of you," Celine said, leaning back against him. "I couldn't have done it without my incredibly terrifying, ridiculously wealthy wife," he teased gently. Celine smiled, looking out at the skyline that she technically owned a significant percentage of. The wealth had never mattered to her. The power was merely a tool. What mattered was the peace she had finally carved out, and the man holding her who had loved her when he thought she had nothing at all. She turned in his arms, her eyes bright and clear. "I told you, Nathaniel. I'm completely self-sufficient." The story of Celine and the Sterling family serves as a dramatic exploration of the perilous illusion of generational arrogance. The Sterlings equated human worth exclusively with visible wealth, designer labels, and social dominance, blinding themselves to the reality that true power rarely needs to announce itself. By weaponizing their status against Celine, they exposed their own deep-seated insecurities and financial fragility. Celine's ultimate triumph was not merely financial domination, but a moral victory. She dismantled a toxic empire using the very systems they worshipped, proving that cruelty is a poor substitute for competence. In the end, the narrative strips away the gilded facade of the elite, leaving behind a satisfying truth. Those who build their empires on the humiliation of others will inevitably find their foundations turned to dust by the very people they underestimated.